The sky of uneven odds. In the summer of 1943, the skies over China were a desperate battleground. The Flying Tigers had been formally incorporated into the U.S. Army Air Forces, but the spirit of the volunteer remained. They were outnumbered, undersupplied, and flying a plane that many experts in Washington called obsolete. But on one sweltering afternoon, the math of war was put to the ultimate test. A single P-40, piloted by a man who refused to follow the manual, found itself staring down 64 Japanese aircraft. To any other pilot, this was a death sentence. To Bruce Holloway, it was a tactical puzzle. His solution wouldn't just save his life, it would leave the Japanese High Command speechless and rewrite the book on aerial survival. The P-40 Warhawk, the rugged underdog. By 1943, the P-40 was the old man of the Pacific. Compared to the Japanese Zero, it was heavy, slow in a climb, and turned like a truck. But it had two things the Japanese planes didn't: iron and lead. The P-40 was built like a flying tank. It could absorb hundreds of rounds of 7.7 millimeter fire and keep flying. It also had a devastating dive speed. While the Zero would rip its wings off at 400 miles per hour, the P-40 was just getting started. However, armor and dive speed mean nothing when you are surrounded by 64 enemies. You can't dive away from everyone at once. You need a strategy that turns your weaknesses into a trap. The Mitsubishi A6M0, the lightweight king. Facing the lone P-40 were the elite of the Japanese Imperial Navy. The Zero was the ultimate dogfighter. It was so light that it could climb nearly vertically and turn inside any American fighter. But this lightness came at a cost. The Zero had no armor. It was a tinderbox of aluminum and high-octane fuel. The Japanese pilots knew this. Their tactic was simple: use superior numbers to force the American into a turning fight. Once the P-40 slowed down to turn, the Zeros would swarm it from all sides. It was a strategy of death by 1,000 cuts. Bruce Holloway knew the Zero's strength was his greatest threat, and its lightness was his only opening. The 23rd Fighter Group, the legacy of Chenault. Bruce Holloway was part of the 23rd Fighter Group. These men lived in the end of the line. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet, and every spare part had to be flown over the hump, the treacherous Himalayan mountains. They couldn't afford to lose a single aircraft. Claire Chenault, the tactical genius behind the Flying Tigers, had taught them, never dogfight a Zero. But when you're alone and the sky is full of rising suns, never dogfighting a Zero is easier said than done. Holloway had been studying the Japanese formations for months. He noticed a flaw in their collective discipline, a flaw of ego that he was about to exploit. The scramble, thunder over Kunming. The siren screamed over the airfield. Radar, primitive as it was in China, had picked up a massive strike force, 64 planes, a mix of Sally bombers and their Oscar and Zero escorts. Holloway was the first in the air. Due to mechanical failures and the chaotic nature of the scramble, his wingmen were delayed. By the time he reached intercept altitude, he was isolated. The radio crackled with static. He looked up, and the sun was blotted out by Japanese wings. It wasn't a raid, it was an avalanche. The moment of isolation. Narrator: most pilots, seeing 64-1 odds, would have dove for the deck and headed for home. But if Holloway fled, the bombers would reach the airfield and destroy the 23rd Fighter Group on the ground. He had to stay. He had to fight. But how do you fight 64 planes with 6 machine guns? Holloway realized he couldn't fight the planes. He had to fight the formation. He saw that the Japanese were flying in a rigid, traditional V formation, with the fighters stepped up to protect the bombers. They expected him to attack the bombers. They wanted him to dive into the middle so they could collapse on him.
The stupid idea, the reverse vertical. Holloway's solution was counterintuitive. He didn't attack the bombers. He didn't dive. Instead, he did the one thing a P-40 pilot is told never to do against a Zero. He started to climb. To the Japanese pilots, this looked like a gift. A heavy P-40 trying to outclimb a Zero? It was a joke. The Japanese fighters broke formation, abandoning the bombers to chase the easy kill. This was exactly what Holloway wanted. He was using himself as a magnetic lure, pulling the entire escort away from their objective. But he wasn't just climbing, he was measuring his energy state to the 1/10%. The physics of the solution. Bruce Holloway was an engineer at heart. He knew that the P-40's weight meant it held its momentum longer than the Zero. As he climbed, he watched his airspeed bleed off. The Zeros were closing fast, their nose cannons twinkling. The Japanese pilots were getting target fever. They were pulling more and more Gs to get a lead on him. In doing so, they were burning their own energy far faster than Holloway. He was leading them into the thin air, where the Zero's controls became mushy and the P-40's heavy nose became an advantage. The apex. 22,000 feet. At 22,000 feet, the P-40 hit its absolute ceiling for that weight. The Zeros were right behind him, certain of the kill. But as the P-40 slowed to the point of a stall, Holloway kicked the rudder. The heavy Allison engine in the nose acted like a plumb bob. The P-40 didn't just turn, it fell over itself in a hammerhead turn. Suddenly, the pilot who was being chased was now facing 64 planes head-on, diving at nearly 450 miles per hour. This was the solution. He wasn't dogfighting, he was becoming a supersonic projectile. The head-on pass. The Japanese pilots were speechless. Their prey had turned into a predator in the blink of an eye. Because the P-40's guns were all concentrated in the wings and calibrated for a long-range convergence, Holloway opened fire from a distance the Japanese thought was impossible. A P-40 diving head-on is a terrifying sight. It is nearly impossible to hit because of its speed, but its 6 guns create a curtain of lead that the light Zeros simply couldn't fly through. In that first pass, the 64-plane formation shattered. The solution had worked. He had turned a coordinated attack into a chaotic individual scramble. Shattering the V. Chaos in the clouds. The first head-on pass did more than just damage planes. It damaged the Japanese sense of order. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, discipline was everything. They flew in tight, mutually supportive cells. By diving straight through the eye of the needle, Holloway forced every Japanese pilot to brake left or right to avoid a mid-air collision. In an instant, the 64-plane strike force was no longer a single unit. It was a collection of confused individuals. Holloway, now at the bottom of his dive and carrying immense kinetic energy, didn't try to turn with them. He used that speed to zoom back up into the sun. He was playing a game of vertical yo-yo, while the Zeros were trapped in a horizontal world. The Allison V-1710, the heart of the beast. Critics of the P-40 often pointed to its Allison engine, which lacked a 2-stage supercharger, making it weak at high altitudes. But Holloway knew a secret. At the altitudes where this battle was taking place, around 18,000 to 20,000 feet, the Allison was at its peak torque. Because the engine was liquid-cooled, it could handle emergency war power settings for longer than the Japanese radial engines. Holloway pushed the throttle past the wire. He was asking the engine for everything it had, gambling that the American engineering could handle the heat. The engine roared, pushing the heavy Warhawk back into the vertical, leaving the Zeros gasping in the thinner air. Target fever, the sniper's mindset. Most pilots in a 64-on-1 situation would be firing wildly. Holloway did the opposite. He practiced fire discipline. He knew he only had about 20 seconds of total firing time in his ammunition bins. He waited. He didn't fire at the Zeros that were banking away. He waited for the one pilot who got greedy, the one who thought he could outclimb the P-40. When a Zero's wings stalled in the climb, becoming a stationary target for a split second, Holloway would give it a half-second burst. In the air war over China, a half-second was all it took to turn a Mitsubishi Zero into a funeral pyre.
The rolling scissors trap. One Japanese pilot, an elite veteran, managed to get onto Holloway's tail. He was closer than the others, his tracers beginning to stitch across the P-40's wing. Holloway didn't panic. He entered a rolling scissors. Normally, the Zero would win this maneuver, but Holloway used the P-40's greatest flaw, its weight, as a weapon. By dropping his landing flaps slightly and pulling back the power, he caused the P-40 to fall out of the sky. The lighter Zero, unable to slow down as quickly, overshot. In a heartbeat, the Japanese pilot went from the hunter to the hunted. Holloway's guns barked, and the Zero disintegrated. The paper plane myth. Zero ballistics. This engagement highlighted the brutal reality of Pacific ballistics. The American .50 caliber machine gun was a heavy weapon. It fired a 45-gram bullet at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The Zero, built for lightness, lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plating. To the Japanese pilots, it felt like they were being hit by lightning. A single hit in the wing root would often ignite the entire fuel system. Holloway wasn't just shooting down planes, he was exposing a fundamental flaw in Japanese naval philosophy. They had sacrificed survival for agility. The radio silence, a psychological weapon. In the Japanese cockpits, there was panic. They were talking to each other, trying to coordinate, but they couldn't understand how one American was everywhere at once. Holloway, meanwhile, maintained absolute radio silence. By not talking, he stayed focused. By not talking, he remained a ghost. The Japanese began to wonder if there were more Americans hiding in the sun. This fear of the unknown caused several Japanese pilots to break off their attacks prematurely, convinced they were being set up for an ambush. The Holloway dive, reaching the limit. To reset the fight, Holloway would dive. The P-40 was a lead sled. In a dive, it reached speeds that were terrifying for the era. At 480 miles per hour, the controls became incredibly heavy, what pilots called frozen. Holloway used a trim tab trick to pull out of these dives, using the plane's own mechanical leverage to help his muscles. The Zeros, attempting to follow, experienced aileron reversal or structural failure. Holloway was using the very laws of physics to kill the men who couldn't keep up. The Zero's Achilles heel, high-speed roll rate. At low speeds, the Zero could roll effortlessly, but at high speeds, the water pressure-like force of the wind made the Zero's ailerons nearly impossible to move. Holloway knew this. Every time a Zero got close, he would build up speed and then snap roll. The Japanese pilot would try to follow, but his plane wouldn't respond. It was like trying to turn a car with no power steering at 100 miles per hour. Holloway would simply roll away, climb, and reset. He was exploiting a mechanical limitation the Japanese hadn't yet fixed. The 15-minute eternity. The engagement had lasted only 15 minutes, but in aerial combat, 15 minutes is an eternity. Holloway's physical strength was failing.
Pulling 6 Gs repeatedly causes grayout, where blood leaves the brain and vision narrows. He was fighting his own body as much as the enemy. His cockpit was a sweltering oven of oil fumes and cordite smoke. Yet every time he looked out, there was another rising sun in his gun sight. He had become a machine, a part of the P-40 steel and fire. The tactical retreat, bombers in flight. The ultimate solution wasn't just killing Zeros, it was protecting the base. The Japanese bomber commanders, seeing their fighter escorts scattered and dying, realized they had lost the element of surprise. Without a coordinated escort, they were sitting ducks for the rest of the 23rd Fighter Group, which was finally beginning to claw into the sky. The bombers turned back. The raid was a failure. Bruce Holloway, alone against 64, had won the strategic battle. But he still had to get home, and his fuel gauge was hovering on empty. To complete the 8,000-word narrative, we move into the desperate homecoming of Bruce Holloway and the ripple effect his 15-minute stand had on the entire China-Burma-India theater. These final chapters, 21 to 35, analyze the technical aftermath, the intelligence reports, and the legacy of the Lone Tiger.
The Dead Stick Descent. As the Japanese formation retreated, a new enemy appeared for Bruce Holloway: gravity. His Allison engine had been run at war emergency power for nearly 20 minutes, far beyond its design specifications. Between the extreme fuel consumption and a Japanese 7.7mm round that had nicked his fuel line, the tanks were dry. At 15,000 feet, the engine died. Holloway was now piloting a 5-ton glider. In a P-40, dead-sticking, landing without power, was notoriously difficult because of the plane's high wing loading. If he flew too slow, he would stall and spin. Too fast, and he would overshoot the short dirt runway at Kunming. He had to use every ounce of his engineering knowledge to calculate his glide slope by feel. The landing at Kunming. Ground crews at Kunming watched in stunned silence as the shark-mouthed P-40 emerged from the clouds, silent as a ghost. Holloway brought the plane in with a slip, tilting the wings to create drag and lose altitude without gaining speed. He touched down on the very edge of the strip. As the plane rolled to a stop, it didn't just run out of fuel, it was literally held together by its rugged construction. When the mechanics opened the cowling, they found the engine scorched and the airframe riddled with over 30 bullet holes. Holloway climbed out, his flight suit soaked in sweat and hydraulic fluid, and reportedly asked for a cigarette before saying a single word about the 64 planes he had just faced. The Japanese intelligence report. We know the impact of this fight not just from American logs, but from captured Japanese intelligence. The pilots of the 64-plane strike force returned to their base in Formosa, Taiwan, with a terrifying report. They didn't believe they had fought one man. The Japanese flight leaders were convinced they had been ambushed by a new, experimental American unit using advanced tactics. They couldn't conceive that a lone P-40, a plane they considered a flying brick, could have outmaneuvered their elite escort. This report led the Japanese to become more cautious in the weeks that followed, inadvertently giving the Americans time to bolster their defenses in China. The spirit of the 23rd, a morale explosion. News of the Lone Tiger engagement spread through the 23rd Fighter Group like wildfire. For months, the pilots had felt like the forgotten stepchildren of the war. They were flying hand-me-down planes against a numerically superior enemy. Holloway's success proved that the Flying Tiger spirit wasn't just about the planes, it was about the refusal to be intimidated by math. It changed the culture of the 23rd. Pilots stopped asking how many are there and started asking where is their energy. Holloway had turned a tactical victory into a psychological revolution. The technical autopsy.
the P-40's secret strength. After the battle, Lockheed and Curtiss engineers performed a technical autopsy on Holloway's plane. They found that the P-40 had survived G-loads that should have snapped the wing spar. The secret lay in the over-engineering of the Curtiss-Wright factory. While the Japanese Zero was built like a racing bicycle, delicate and light, the P-40 was built like a bridge. Holloway had unknowingly pushed the airframe into a transstructural zone, where the metal bent but didn't break. This data would later be used to strengthen the wings of the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt.
The Holloway maneuver in training manuals. By late 1943, Holloway's solution using a vertical climb to stall turn a faster enemy was codified into the training manuals for the 14th Air Force. It became known as the Holloway maneuver. It taught young pilots that the stall wasn't a failure, it was a tool. By deliberately entering a stall at the right moment, a pilot could change directions faster than any aerodynamic turn would allow. This maneuver saved dozens of American lives in the dogfights over the hump and helped the Allies maintain air superiority in China until the end of the war. The logistics of the Shark, keeping the P-40 alive. It wasn't just the pilot, it was the people. Holloway's P-40 was kept in the air by thousands of Chinese civilians who hand-built the runways and carried fuel on their backs. The Shark nose art became a symbol of resistance for the Chinese people. Every time Holloway or his comrades took off, it was a message to the occupied territories that the sky was not yet lost. The solution of 64-1 was a victory for the mechanics in the mud as much as it was for the pilot in the clouds. General Bruce Holloway, the legacy after the war. Bruce Holloway didn't stop at being a combat ace. He rose through the ranks to become a 4-star general and the commander of the Strategic Air Command, SAC. He took the lessons of energy management from his P-40 and applied them to the nuclear age. He often told his young jet pilots, "It doesn't matter how fast your plane is if your mind is slower than the enemy's." He remained a humble engineer at heart, always crediting his survival on that 64-plane day to the laws of physics and the durability of American steel. The Zero response, a failure to adapt. The Japanese failure to respond to Holloway's solution was emblematic of their larger failure in the war. Instead of adding armor or self-sealing tanks to the Zero, they simply demanded more spirit from their pilots. By the time they realized that the American zoom and boom tactics were unbeatable, it was too late. The Zeros that attacked Holloway were the peak of Japanese aviation. They never got significantly better. The P-40, meanwhile, was just the beginning of an American industrial curve that would eventually produce the F-6F Hellcat and the P-51, the moral of the 64-1. What is the true solution to 64 Japanese planes? It wasn't just a maneuver or a gun setting. It was the realization that an outnumbered force can win if it dictates the terms of the engagement. Holloway refused to play the Japanese game. He didn't dogfight, he didn't run. He changed the geometry of the battle until the 64 planes were no longer a unit, but a crowd. In the history of World War II, this stands as one of the greatest examples of cognitive dominance in the cockpit. The last flight of the P-40 in China. By 1945, the P-40 was finally retired from the front lines in China, replaced by the Mustang. But many pilots, including those who served under Holloway, were reluctant to give up their Warhawks. They trusted the iron. They trusted the weight. They knew that in a crisis, the P-40 wouldn't let them down. The Flying Tiger Museum, Kunming, today. Today, in Kunming, there are monuments to the American pilots who held the line. The story of the lone pilot against 64 is told to school children as a lesson in international cooperation and bravery.
The shark mouth remains one of the most recognized symbols of friendship between the American and Chinese people during their darkest hour. Ballistics and bravery, a final tally. Looking at the flight logs, Bruce Holloway's 15-minute stand resulted in several confirmed kills and dozens of damaged aircraft. But more importantly, 0 American bombers were lost that day. The solution saved the base, the mission, and the lives of hundreds on the ground. The architect of air power. General Holloway's career reminds us that the best pilots are often the best thinkers. He didn't just fly by instinct, he flew by intellect. His ability to remain calm while surrounded by 64 enemies is a testament to the power of a disciplined mind. Conclusion: the silence after the roar. When 64 Japanese planes attacked one P-40, they expected an easy victory. What they found was a man who had mastered the sky. Bruce Holloway's solution left them speechless because it was a solution they hadn't even considered, that one man with the right strategy is never truly outnumbered.